Okay, welcome to the CEFACT Global Trust Registry project. The meeting will be recorded, transcripts automatically generated, and the minutes of the meeting are then produced automatically. I do review those to correct spelling errors and other things if I can see them. It's actually a pretty good system. And also any chat messages you choose to put on the chat will be part of that sort of recording as well. But I do encourage you to talk and chat and type things. That's actually a good thing if you do. Point of order, just as we start, a reminder about codes of conduct and intellectual property rights that we follow as the CEFACT project. They should be familiar to all of us on this call. The code of conduct is a general sort of reminder that we should welcome people into the conversation, particularly those that are part of a head of delegation's recommendation. And the intellectual property rights are the no royalty fees, global access and use, open standards kind of approach, which again, I know this audience is very familiar with. I've done something in the background, and I don't know if I've got this easily accessible, but on the, I know a few people have had significant challenges in getting kind of applications for registration as an expert to be processed in sort of reasonable timeframes. So what Steve's advised me in the past is that it's perfectly reasonable to merely ask that people have accepted the terms and conditions, that is the code of conduct and the intellectual property rights. So what I've done is I've tweaked a form that's available on our kind of very simple site to say that you accept the code of conduct and the intellectual property rights, and you want to actively participate. So that's a bit of a short circuit for processes might otherwise take a bit of time to get through. And I know, Daryl, I think you've been part of that, and maybe some others. So from my point of view, I know that you accept those implicitly, but if you want to tick the box in the form and send that'll trigger an email that we have then, which would be cool. I'll go back to the deck. The thing I wanted to focus on, a few things today, and Sankishan's presence will help me a bit if he can talk in the quiet silence of early morning in India. A bit of a recap on 2 weeks ago, and then talk about some of the work that's been going on over the last few weeks. And that actually took up most of the meeting we had 17 hours ago in discussion about sort of what the meaning of this was and how we could use it. Generally positive, actually really quite strongly positive responses to the work that had been done. That didn't leave too much time to talk about the actual sort of DIA, digital identity anchor structure, but we may have more time today to talk about that. 2 weeks ago, we talked about how the sort of broad concept thing might actually work. How might such a curated body under a UN organization do the business we want it to do, would be a directory for data about authoritative registrars around the world. And we looked at 2 examples of existing systems in some detail. One was the CEFACT low code system, and the other is ICAO's PKD. And there was merit in both of those, and there's merit in others as well. We've previously looked at Glyph, for example, as another system of a different sort of type, but very similar interest to ours. It's part of our making sure we're learning, if you like, from others and not ignorantly proceeding without taking advantage of good work that's been done elsewhere. What we then did was we shifted into looking at the work others have done. Now, at that point yesterday, I was able to take advantage of Sankishan and Alina's presence. Sankishan, are you in any position to walk through what we walked through yesterday? Is that possible, or is it a bit too tricky for you this morning?
No, that's possible. We'll do that.
Okay. Do you want to do what we did yesterday, and you shared your screen and showed the deliverables folder and kind of explained what you're doing? We can just remind people, I guess, about the conversation we had yesterday, or not remind, inform them of the conversation yesterday, and then they can then make comment if they wish.
I can do that. Let me figure out what window that I have for all of this is.
Okay, while you're doing that, I'll set the stage. Sankishan offered a few weeks ago to help me and Alina do some of the sort of background work on these documents. So he was looking at comments on the current DIA spec. That it's quite funny. This is to Steve. Zachary Zeus now, Steve, has rung me on exactly the time I'm doing these meetings twice. That's really funny. Zach is very active in the UNTP space. So I've just put up on my screen, and now we've got the view of Sankashan's screen around. I'll go to the DIA spec. The DIA spec is currently hosted on a GitLab environment. And it's this text here that Marcus Allende had a look at, and he came up with some suggestions. So I'll flip over now to you, Sankashan. You can talk through what you were doing with. Oh, did you stop sharing your screen, Sankashan?
I did, because folks might be confused seeing who's sharing what. So we can continue with your screen if you are okay with that.
No, I prefer to let you speak and me be quiet for a bit, and you can please share your screen. I'll stop presenting.
All right. So Marcus actually took the DIA text of the DIA spec that exists, and he ensured that there is a whole bunch of things that he wanted to do. Here's the document, which is called working draft from Marcus. So he added a whole bunch of changes that are as comments, which is kind of awkward if we want to actually propose this back to the DIA project. I ended up taking all of these comments and wrapping them into one single document, which is this. The spec for PR is conveniently titled, but every time I seem to miss finding. Anyways, so this is the consolidation of all the comments from Marcus. That the comments which indicate that he feels there is a need to refine definitions or add a new term in the glossary, those are not in this document. Those are still in the original document. And the way I think I have been talking with John and Alina is, we will have to figure out a way to actually propose these changes back to the DIA spec owners for evaluation and merging as pull requests of some sort. And the glossary definition highlights that Marcus has done. They should probably end up being individual issues and then corresponding pull requests. I'm assuming that is the way the project, DIA project operates and handles incoming requests and changes.
That would be ideal, yes. You could create an issue and just post this and say, here's the discussion, because it's quite nice to have an issue describing the concern and a little discussion around it as kind of support or evidence for a subsequent pull request. But I'm sure the DIA project will be delighted to receive such feedback from people like Marcus, who have a lot to contribute. So yeah, just if you need help to make a PR, we can help you with that.
So that's great, Steve. So my thinking would be, we could use the two documents that Sankashan has just shown us that exist, if you like, the original from Marcus, how Sankashan has understood and consolidated these into a sort of a new document. We could put the links of those into the issue, if you like, on the GitLab environment, the UNICC hosted GitLab environment, for the UNTP spec, for the parts that are the DIA specification currently. Is that the way you see that happening?
Yeah, that's fine. Raise an issue, put links to the documents. We'll find somebody to turn it into a PR.
And I don't mind if we find it reasonably easy to do. I don't mind us creating the PR as well, right? I'm just sort of saying we can give you that history. That
would be even better, because then the history shows who it comes from. Because if, for example, if I raise the PR, then it looks like I'm making an update to my own spec, and it's actually much better if it comes from Marcus or you guys, Yep.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. So Sankashan, that I think your logic was right. Okay. So we'll do that. You and I can work on that over the next few days to sort of get that into the system. To do the issue, you need to be registered on the UNICC site. And that, I think, Steve, still requires being registered as a CEFACT expert, or is that now a separate consideration?
That's separate. So if you've got some evidence that IPR is signed off, it'll do. Cool. Just self-register on UNICC, and they usually approve that within a day.
Excellent. Yeah. Thank you, Sankashan. I'll hand the mic back to you.
All right. So the other thing that came up for discussion yesterday is that if we consider the DIA project to be a sort of upstream to the current project, the GTR, then it is quite possible that there's going to be in the future change sets that are requested into the upstream. And we plan to do that via the same issue PR route, and then have discussions with the DIA maintainers to be able to see how those get in and how we can advocate for those changes to be made part of the DIA spec. That's pretty much what we were discussing in terms of how we engage with DIA to ensure that we are using DIA correctly, as well as ensuring that our needs are also recorded on the DIA project. I think that's pretty standard and that should be fine. And I'll defer to you, Steve, on that.
That'll be fine. Look, we initially considered actually moving the DIA spec to your project so that you are the authoritative owner of it, not UNTP, because it's actually more tightly related to your outcomes than to you. It's only there because it kind of started its life there. So I'm sure that you guys will be the primary drivers of it.
I agree, Steve. That's what we were both originally envisaging when we started this in sort of April, January, February, March, whatever this year. Thinking of it now, my current thinking is we will do as Sankashan said. If we decide to sort of bring that into the space that's under the GTR project's sort of control, then fine. I'm thinking in terms of what's the best way for a reader to understand this, and particularly an implementer. So if somebody wants to implement a compliance solution for the UNTP spec, my feeling is that the DIA part of that is explicitly part of that specification implementation or an understanding. So I kind of feel that having them in the same place is probably a good thing. But I'm very happy if you and I or others choose, we should move them.
I don't think it's a super critical decision to make now, right? Wherever it is, you can point at it anyway, right?
Yeah, exactly right. So let's leave it where it is right now, update it, and then decide if it feels better to be in a separate space. We'll do that.
Okay, so that was all that I wanted to talk about the DI. I'm going to stop sharing my screen at this point. John, back to you.
Okay, I'm going to remind you of another one that you worked on as well yesterday, which was the checklist for registrars. Do you want to show that, or shall I talk to that?
I'll bring it up on screen. You can provide some context as to why we ended up.
Okay. Thank you. So this document that you're looking at is like an abstraction. It takes from another document a set of the kind of key requirements that are elaborated in the sort of eligibility requirements for a registrar to meet to be considered eligible to be in this directory that we're going to propose. Now, the reason for having those is to allow organizations to have a reasonably simple checklist to have a look through to say, are we ready? Do we meet the kind of core requirements that are going to be expected of us? Or is there some homework that we need to do? Or are there some questions that we want to ask? So the checklist is like a simple standalone document. It's likely that this artifact and some others that we'll show you in a second become kind of like appendices to the body of work that we produce. Sort of, here's a template for a checklist, here's a template for some other things. Because if we're writing a recommendation or any such thing about how to create a new organization that looks after this directory, we don't want the recommendation itself to be overburdened with specific details which will need to be worked on before they become finalized. But we want that work to look substantive enough that it gives credibility, if you like. That, you know, here's an example of a checklist which has some actually reasonably good requirements in it about how we might consider the eligibility of a registrar for entry into the directory. So this is the work that Sankashan has been doing. What he basically did was take that first column is from the sort of requirements, original requirements document that Alina produced, which was our #1 deliverables. We just numbered them in order of realizing we needed them. And that what we were discussing yesterday was how do we make sure these two things stay aligned, if you like. What we also discussed, as I'll show you in a second when I start resharing my screen, is that there's another body of work that Alina started and did some substantive work on over the last couple of weeks on the governance requirements for this centralized service. And those governance requirements also included some idea around eligibility of the entries into this directory. So what we realized we could do is consolidate some stuff. We don't want to sort of duplicate and get things out of sync or do things more than once if we don't have to. So this document, I think, will survive or become a standalone part of maybe an appendix or something else of the body of work that we finish with. But the idea, certainly with yesterday's audience, was well received, that there should be some simple way to sense whether or not you meet the kind of requirements that we're thinking of for eligibility to be in this directory. Does that make sense to everybody? I'll take silence as a yes, by the way. Yes, I like that. Thumbs up from Paul. So with that, I'll go back to screen share in a second. I'll get the right thing up. I'll actually share this temporarily just to, I made some references to numbers of documents and stuff, and I just want to make sure that you know where you can look to find these things. Can
I ask one question?
Yes, please.
In terms of eligibility to sort of have an entry in the directory, are we thinking of different, if you like, tiers or categories of integrity of entries? Because there's sort of important value to say, you know, this is the National Authoritative Business Register and it's got these governance processes. But there's also sometimes potentially some value in having less authoritative registers that are still useful in a supply chain context and might have some useful stuff you can put in a register. Like, for example, given an ID of let's pick GS1, right? Given a GTIN, how do you turn it into a what's the pattern for making a resolvable query out of it? No, it's not an authoritative register in a national governance sense, but it's still a useful register. Are we thinking of sort of different criteria?
Such a good question, Stephen. I mean, yeah, we've spent quite a bit of time talking about that in the sort of other the other meetings at different time zone meetings on that point. Where Alina's thinking is settling at the moment is her initial aim is and focuses on what she's calling authoritative registrars, those that are recognized as the legal registrar for their jurisdiction. That's a sort of a hard constraint, if you like, on the eligibility that she initially has been applying. Even if you take that constraint, as you've just said, there may be levels of maturity, if you like, about the processes that are followed by that registrar. Nevertheless, that registrar might still be registering things of note or importance in trade, and therefore it will be foolish in some ways to not consider them as they are in fact the authoritative registrar for this thing in that place. Paul, yes.
The other one that comes up a lot in these contexts is intermediaries as well. So, you know, you might have the authoritative registrar in a particular country, but then they license that function or that service to a number of private sector vendors.
Where exactly right, Paul? And that actually was part of a conversation I had after yesterday's meeting. I spoke with a number of a group called ID Union and a company's CEO called Sperity CEO. They're very, very active in the German sort of space about trade and verifiable credentials and stuff. And they were very interested in getting a particular German organization that's actually acting as what's called a local operating unit for Gleich. It's a global interest, but it registers organizations and companies, and particularly German ones. It's recognized by the German government as an authority, and so on as part of this. Now, I've got a couple of concerns about this. Concerns. I like the idea, right? Concern isn't the right word necessarily to use, but scope is one of them, right? I've got a kind of project management hat on. I kind of think, Christ, if we just recognize everything, we'll never stop, right? So it helps me to stay sane, to think, well, let's find some criteria that make sense, like minimum viable criteria to start with. Not precluding or objecting to the idea that in the future, the directory might include other registrars of interest. But the reason I don't want to go there first is that I want the recommendation to be acceptable. And to be acceptable, it needs not to conflict with existing commercial interests, or not to be seen to be in conflict with those existing commercial interests. And it needs to be focused hard on the things that matter to the United Nations, which is countries. So you kind of want to make sure that the country's interests are well represented. It's a UN CEFACT kind of United Nations kind of thing. So yes, of course, those other things are really interesting and important for trade. But we don't want to cloud the waters initially about what might be in this directory and cause unnecessary kind of confusion or conflict. To Steve's point, I've been wary of giving a kind of a measure, if you like, of maturity in the directory itself about what others are doing. I'm concerned not to unnecessarily kind of give a qualitative assessment about another country's maturity. I'm kind of the mind that says, we transparently declare what they have and how they do things. And they tell us that. They tell us what the legal framework is, what the laws are that they rely on, how they publish and things and so on. It's up to others to decide whether they trust that or not. Ultimately, that's always the case. The relying party makes a decision based on the evidence before them. And I therefore only want a kind of minimal viable criteria to get in, but they're still meaningful criteria. But they're not overburdensome, so that developing countries and others have a chance of getting in, but without, so we haven't set the hurdle so high that nobody can get over in it except a few countries in the world, which would be the antithesis of what we want. So that's kind of where I'm thinking, Steve. So the answers are for both you and Paul are yes, but maybe not in the first instance.
I think that's entirely reasonable. No objection to anything you've said.
Cool, thank you. Now, what you see on this screen in front of us right now is a kind of a bit of a forest of stuff, right? It's the original logical model for this project, which has a sort of a sketch of a pseudo kind of supply chain across 4 different jurisdictions. The little classic Greek temple things are a symbol for the registrars of those jurisdictions. And the idea is in the central wheel is some idea of this directory of those registrars in those jurisdictions. And we started labeling on this the sorts of deliverables we thought we might need. What seems to be an opportunity for us is to simplify this a little in terms of the numbers of deliverables. We still will need to, and that's what today's discussion was meant to get onto, look at the actual structures and meaning of data and content of a digital identity anchor. That's kind of one of our primary objectives for this project. But where we look at things like eligibility requirements, the type of data to be recorded, governance and operations, we might well be able to consolidate these into a sort of more simplified document structure. I'll show you in a second what Alina was working on, and hopefully that will give you a sense of why I think that's the case. And then these 2 things on the right-hand corner, the implementation pilots and how to implement, are learnings that we take when we run these pilots. We'll learn about the actual realities of using these ideas we've got, and hopefully that will sharpen the content of both the DIA spec and the how we might run such a thing. So that's the sort of where we're heading. So that was why I was referring to the idea that this, for example, number 1, eligibility requirements to be met, might actually fall into the sort of governance and operations document, which I will now show you. So I'll zoom in a bit to make it maybe a bit more visible, particularly if you're on a phone, Steve. I have no idea how you're reading this. So this document was created as a placeholder a while ago. Each document that we have has a standard about the project, which we pull in from one space, one document. So the first page or so is always the same in each of the documents we produce. We do write a particular purpose structure sort of separately. We're going to follow this must-shall kind of process that's standard for a lot of projects. We have a definitions register. Now, what's happened since this was first drawn, this is another shared repository, if you like. This is a spreadsheet. Is Alina's come up with a number of terms that would need to be included in a more inclusive direct glossary of terms that we're using for this project. Those terms haven't been pulled into this one yet. And we've got a question we need to resolve, by the way. I noticed, Sankashan, about why we have both an authoritative registrar and a public legal register. Now, Lena's a lawyer, so I'm pretty sure she has a reason for these things, but I need to ask her why we have those two terms and what we should understand is the difference between them. This part of the document then was a body of work that was done quite early on. Lena had a fair hand in producing this, and both Sankishan and I have been through it, sort of asked questions and so on. What then has happened is that Lena's produced another separate substantive body of work based on ICAO PKD, the system from ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Authority organization, sorry, and their public key directory service, and also UN CEFACT low code, that both of which provide their kind of governance frameworks publicly. You can kind of go through them and see what they say. So she's done the kind of a hybrid of these two to come up with a kind of this document. So in this document, she starts off with a list of terms, again, that she proposes are used, and I'm going to, in the next few days and weeks, take that into the glossary of terms. A heads up on this phrase that's here. I'm not always that disciplined. I'm trying to be disciplined. This project is called the Global Trust Registry Project, and it will stay that name throughout its lifetime. The system we propose is created, or we recommend is created, may not be called the Global Trust Registry. It could be called something else. I think it may be better to call it something else, because calling it the Global Trust Registry can cause confusion in the minds of the hearer. So one suggestion, I came up with two suggestions, but I'm not beholden to either. One is the idea of a UN CEFACT Authoritative Registrar Directory card. The other is the idea of a Global Registrar Information Directory, GRID. And like any techie, I kind of like making acronyms that you can say. So if it's on the grid, that kind of makes some sense to me. I can play with that. So when you see the GTR, we're probably going to change that to something globally, to some term, like Alina's done with UN body. We don't know which UN body should look after this. It's probably UN CEFACT, but we don't want it to be prejudiced, if you like, in terms of the decision. We're just suggesting it should be a UN body, and the best one, it should be the best fit for purpose that looks after it. Steve, is that okay? So doing that sort of UN body approach that on the grid is cool. Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yeah. I think write it in abstract at the moment, and then we find the right home for it. Absolutely. Cool. There is actually, as everyone knows, right? There's some UN budget cuts happening, and there's kind of two phases of rationalization of the UN that's going to happen. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending how you look at it. The first is just cuts of about 20% across the board in the UN, but with more or less within the current organization. That's this year. And then next year, there'll be a fair bit of soul searching about, well, this UN entity that's been in this place for this mandate for the last 30 years, should it stay there? Should it merge with something else? So we're actually got a window next year to think about where in the UN architecture does something like this live. It doesn't necessarily have to stay in UN CEFACT if we can make a case for somewhere that's better, right?
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Steve. These are going to be, no doubt, interesting times for the next 12 months for the UN in so many ways. The one observation from me, just personal, is that having UN CEFACT underneath UNECE, which is the European regional body part of the UN, is it's not a problem whatsoever, but it's sort of confusing for some in the sense of, well, does that mean it only has a regional interest? And obviously not. It's global.
Yes, that's a common confusion, and that's one of the reasons we've been even thinking about organizations like UNCTAD and other bits of the UN that also have a similar mandate and a clearer global footprint. But anyway, the important thing is the work itself, right? It has value. Then where you put it can change.
And that's a really important point, Steve, because the other thing we picked up on the discussion 2 weeks ago about UN low code and ICAO's PKD, we were quite admiring ICAO's PKD because it's self-sustaining. It's got a definite, clear value proposition. People are willing participants in it, and it doesn't need to ask for money from anybody. It gets the amount of money it needs to run its operation. It's not a large amount of money whatsoever, and it does a global service. So it's sort of a nice model of sustainable service delivery. And that's sort of something we obviously need to aim for.
And I think low code's going to try and borrow some of PKD's ideas about funding from contributors, because it's also, it's one of those things that not that well known, but hundreds of millions of consignments every year go from place to place, and everyone's a low code. So these kind of things are actually quite fundamental infrastructure, and I think that your project is another candidate along those lines, right? And if it's a valuable thing and perceived as valuable, then a small fee, a bit like the ICAO PKD fee, it doesn't have to be much. From the perspective of a national register, it's a drop in the ocean, really, to maintain a high quality, well maintained UN directory. Seems like a no-brainer, right? So I would certainly consider a fee-based structure in your governance model.
So you'll see that as we go through. I'll proceed and you'll see it. So the fundamental principles, these are ones that again Alina's abstracted out of the two sources I mentioned, but others as well. So you'll see a kind of a list of things like legality and respect for domestic competencies. She's very keen to ensure that nothing we do is seen to undermine or change the meaning of the legal constructs of countries and what they represent and what they stand for. We're just a directory of those things that exist. We don't influence or change those things. That there's a due process and decision making clearly articulated in this organization, transparency and accountability. So a lot of things that she's clearly kind of thought through and articulated in this list of the fundamental principles. There's a few instances where we use legal terms that I think are particularly meaningful. I'll see if I can get a plain English kind of version of some of them in the text. So derogate and derogation, if you like, there can be like detract from or take away, but I don't know whether or not that's advisable to change that word because it might have a different legal interpretation. So we'll look for it. But basically, she's saying in this section that nothing we do here will change what happens in the legal jurisdictions of the state nations in the members. Then she talks about the structure of the thing itself. Again, using this term UN body to denote something that is yet to exist, but the thing that will exist, and how it should be constituted. So this is borrowed from a number of these documents. It talks about having a board, how big the board should be, the kind of things the board should be concerned about, how board members are nominated and appointed, the transparency in officers and so on. There's a really cool bit I noticed at one point. Here, I'll just show you the depth of thinking she goes to. Terms for the board members should be staggered to ensure continuity. I just realized, oh, that's a really smart idea. That means the whole board doesn't change every 3 years. There's a kind of a rotation process, but there's always somebody with experience in the board. Secretariat and operator are this idea, again, that comes from ICAO's PKD, and talks to the idea of somebody operates the system that you're talking about. You may let that out as a service contract to an operator. How participation is enabled for members that wish to join. This dossier that she's referring to, you'll see, is the thing that leads to the idea of what information do we need to know. And that's articulated a bit later on in this document. Admission inclusion procedure. So the idea that she's talking about here is the sort of eligibility. This is where I said there's a bit of a repeat, if you like, and an opportunity to consolidate the materials so that we could either take the eligibility into a kind of a section that's updatable in its own right, or perhaps include it in the body of this document here. National focal points is, that's familiar if you look at low code's structure. Low code asks for national focal points. That is the person or role that is responsible for providing updates to low code data and agreeing to or reviewing those proposed updates that others make. There's a few instances where Alina agrees, by the way, we should remove technology terms if they're not absolutely necessary in this type of text, that we'll try and make sure this is technology neutral and doesn't include any kind of expectations about specific technologies. The admission criteria is the point Steve was making earlier on, and Paul was making as well, about the kind of things that we require people to, or organizations to have met such that they can be considered. So this has a close alliance with that checklist that Shankar was saying us earlier, how the decisions will be made. Also includes, if not here, then you'll see it later, how the decisions might be disagreed with, how you can kind of dispute, and the resolution process for that. The ongoing obligations for the organization, that is, what we need to do to make sure that this is stays running and true and to its cause. How we go through changes itself, sort of like the bootstrapping process for a change within the organization itself. The sanctions, this is a UN, anticipate to be a UN-run organization, so we need to consider things like sanctions, and we probably would anyway, even if we weren't the UN. So what happens if a country is sanctioned? Or what do we do about that? If they're removed from a sanction list, what do we do about that? And emergency actions, effective measures. I'm scrolling through quite quickly, but Sankishan, if you're able, or somebody, you can post the link maybe for this document. I'll say what I said yesterday, that this document is open for review amongst this group and the others that are participating in this project. We're quite keen to get comments and suggestions for improvement or completion or whatever else that might be necessary on the document. It would be good to have other eyes looking at it. There are two lawyers, Jean Huang from UTS, I think is her university here in Australia. Steve is, I think, interested in another lady I met at another project, Margot, who's also another lawyer familiar with UN CITRAL, MLETR kind of concepts. Fees is where we start talking about those fees that Steve was talking to. The number that ICAO PKD charges proportional to the number of participants. So as they get more participants, the fees go down. And they are currently at, say, $20,000 US a year per country. So the whole of a country will pay only $20,000 to participate in PKD and to be able to have that kind of free flow of passengers under e-readable passports. And then she goes down into some of the more details, so technical and security policies, which again, we'll need to be quite careful about making these sufficiently detailed, but also robust, and that they don't get broken by some change of technology or the onset of post-quantum computing or whatever else that happens. And I think that's probably the main body of, I mean, you can see there's a lot in here. Transition and interpretive provisions draft. So what we're going to be doing over the next 2 weeks is that taking this document, if you remember at the beginning of it, there was some old text that predated the new work by Elena. So I'm going to have to, or we will have to work out how to kind of merge that old and new together to have just one, and also to do the work on the glossary so that the glossary has a complete set of the terms that we wish to use that's referenceable by other documents. When we've got to that point, Steve, I'm getting more confident about moving the stuff into the GitLab and Markdown sort of territory that we know we're going to move into as a project.
Sure. This is great work, I think. What we should do, I mean, it's good. I'm not eminently qualified to comment on it, right? I'm not a lawyer either, but I think Alina's done an amazing job. If you get Jean and a few other lawyers to comment, what we should also do is I'll get Matthias from the Secretariat to have a look and figure out who in the UN ecosystem, including maybe somebody from UN CITRAL or someone like that, might also give you a review. So that you know, we can get that done probably fairly quickly, and then I think you're right, it's a candidate to put up as a draft on a public website. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think I'd love that approach. Thanks, Steve. That'd be great, because what I'm trying to do, I'm learning from your example partly, is let's prepare the ground so that there's less opportunity for resistance or less need for resistance. Many others have seen it already. It's gone through a lot of expert views. You know, it's acceptable, if you like, and hopefully more than acceptable, it's actually attractive. But so that would be great if you can help me do that. That'll be fabulous. So that's the body of work that both Sankishan and Alina had been doing. What I wanted to spend the time on, and I don't mind that we didn't get to it too much today either, is this idea that we need to start looking at the practical meaning of this digital identity anchor and what's inside it in some detail. Now that detail is already to some extent present. So you've got a specification inside the current UNTP spec that you can have a look at, which has sort of breakdowns of structures, and you can see not only a narrative describing the basic idea of the digital identity anchor, but you can also see some sort of more substantive qualities like the actual sort of logical model, and even the sort of the structures of the data content that is expected. I think I might jump there. Will I open that? Yeah. So you can see that this is on a Java shell, so we can sort of see it in a slightly more easy way. But what we need to do is to start drilling down into this and thinking about how does it actually work in practice. If we have our anticipated interaction, which I will find the diagram for here in a second, something like this one where we're talking about how a digital identity anchor is being used, we start realizing what we would like a digital identity anchor to contain. And we also will start realizing what else it might usefully contain. And that might include, for example, not just as is already anticipated, the business identifier issued to that organization by a registrar, but also the DIDs that organization has offered to the registrar. I'll get there in a second, Mark. And but also potentially other materials that have been provided to the registrar by the organization. So Mark just popped up a request to sort of see that structure. So Mark, if I share this on the chat, if it hasn't been done already, this is the existing GitLab posted pages of the UNTP spec, and that's where you'll find this page here. And in that, you'll find, as you scroll down, the sort of the link that I click to get to that jargon shell page and so on. So you'll see all the sort of details under the covers there. Now, while Steve's also online, this has already been, Steve, have we already got any implementations using the DIA in sort of pilot form or tests?
Only a few sort of technical proofs of concept at the moment. So the whole UNTP thing is still in development, right? When we expect enhancements and improvements, and particularly the DIA, to be honest, hasn't had much attention. It's a first draft that hasn't changed much, and so people shouldn't feel like it's a lockdown authoritative thing. You need to make it work for you.
Yes,
and you'll see one or two things in there like scope and role, because there's, and that might be a thorny one, because there is an idea, for example, that the DIA might also serve a role in some kind of decentralized access control model, where somebody's asserting to a role, an authority is asserting to a role of an entity. That gets quite hairy, and to be honest, we haven't given it enough thought. But yeah, we need the right experts in this group to think that through.
I felt like saying challenge accepted. So yes, I felt that was what we would have to do. But it'd be great, even if there are existing kind of libraries that have evidenced an implementation. That's kind of cool. Paul.
Yeah, I mean, just continuing that point. I mean, even the term that always throws me is the word identity. Mm-hmm. And I take it what the DIA is actually meant to be is a digital trust anchor, not a digital identity anchor, or is that just semantics? Because if we
never do semantics, right?
Well, I'm just wondering if you're getting confused.
So I would encourage us, at least this is my mindset, okay, about this. We've all, many people on this call have spent quite a lot of their lives talking about identity and identifiers and so on. And I think I encourage the idea of a plurality of identifiers. So one of the things we're certainly not doing is creating some sort of universal singular identifier for everything in the universe or whatever. We're not doing that. What we want to do is recognize what identifiers already exist. In other words, and the ones we want to recognize are those that are issued by authoritative registrars. So that allows us to include glyphs, LEIs. It allows us to include an ABN number from ASIC. It allows us to include a VAT number from the UK's company house, whatever it is, and so on. So it's sort of, we're not trying to boil that ocean, right? What we are interested in are things that are necessary or useful for trade to identify the participants and the articles that they're claiming and shipping and doing.
But if I go back to the use case that we're talking about, if I recall rightly, there were references to facilities and
yes.
things like that. And I suppose what I'm trying to it
sounds like it's going to sound like I'm sloping my shoulders, but the answer to the question, what is a facility identifier, is whatever the organization that identifies facilities has called it. So there is an opportunity to recommend standardization of things. And that's what the DIA spec will recommend. It will recommend a standardization of a thing, but the things it contains, the particular references that a particular registrar uses for its organizations, we can't tell them to standardize that. And so there's a number of credentials that are used. And if I scroll to a different image here, if I go to this one here, this is just a conformancy credential, but imagine this was the facility identifier. So somebody's gone along and recognized that this is in fact a facility. It's a necessary for the regulator to recognize this plant or this process or this mine as a particular facility, and you're given this identifier by that registrar. And what we want to enable is that recognition is something that the holder can then present to others downstream of it in a supply chain to prove that, yeah, I'm doing this particular operation from this facility recognized as organic or something. Probably stretching the analogy here, but to others further downstream, so that they can be assured. Now, we can't make the registrar use an international standard recognition for facilities yet. Hopefully, over time, it becomes more and more obvious that it would be a good idea if we all use the same sort of approach. But we don't need to boil the ocean of that at the moment.
Yeah, no, I hear you. Yeah.
So that's sort of was where we got to, and it's 10 minutes to the top of the hour. So you can see I still want to talk in meaningful detail about digital identity anchors and how they're actually used and what's inside them and how they are resolved, how they're issued, how they held. That sort of teasing apart, as Steve was saying, of the actual draft that exists already, and seeing does that actually work if we test it. Now, the best way for us to test it is going to be in the pilots, really. And what we could find is the conversation about the existing spec gives us areas that we want the pilots to explore. So there's a sort of pull push kind of thing happening here. The pilots might themselves come up with observations that require us to change the spec or make improvements. And the thinking about the spec might come up with ideas that we want to explore in the pilot to see how those work.
Can we just to Mark's comment about, are we talking about identity or identification? It's a an important distinction. Should we make clear that really what we're talking about is, in some ways, it's evidence of registration, right? The premise here is that there are all kinds of registers around the world that have some governance process and some authority to register something, whether it's a trademark or a business, and issue an identification for that registration. And what we're trying to do is just make that registration and the subsequent issued identification digitally verifiable, right? That's it, pretty much.
Yep.
And how to find the right words so that those not intimately in the space understand what we're saying, but also those that really care, as you do, and reasonably so, right, about the difference in identity and identification. But we also get the language right. So I'm, a lot of things in UNTP that have morphed into broader use. People say, why did you call it that? And the simple answer is, because that's what we thought of at the time. It needn't lock it down. But if we're going to change it, have some consideration and think about a better name, like your grid. I quite like grid.
Thank you.
and feel empowered, right? But yeah.
It could well be. I mean, I'm literally voicing this without thinking about it, which is dreadfully dangerous. But it could be that it's the digital identifier anchor rather than digital identity anchor or something. It could be something like that that gets us away from a risk of more than we will get misunderstandings. I mean, they're always going to be need to explain.
Really, it's a registration certificate in some ways, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's linked. You know, so I mean, yeah.
So
we needn't
the reason-
feel. Yeah, go on. Sorry.
So I think the really important consideration is that when you're talking about, you know, if we connect the two words identity and trust together, right, they mean something completely different to humans who have defined this in social society and law and commerce way before the technology of an identifier was sort of weaponized in commercial technology or society. So, you know, you're really confusing and creating a lot of risk by using those two words, trust and identity, when you're really talking about security in identification. Because it also closes the door for real innovation and development in trust and identity in society, because you're calling it something that it isn't, which is, you know, the realm in the area which we work with in terms of registries and transparency registries for AI, for example. It's really about transparency and trust. So what we call transparency and trust registry is very different than what you're talking about with an identification and trust registry, which is about security. And it's a really hot geopolitical topic, if you can imagine, between Canada and the US, you know, on the front lines of this pretty, you know, lit policy sort of discussion. So I just like, you know, it creates a lot of risk and it makes it more difficult for the good guys if you misname things, identity and trust, when you're not actually talking about identity and trust, because there's actually people that do work on identity and trust.
Yeah, you're so right, Mark, and you know you're right, by the way. I know you're right, and I think that means that we do need to be very careful about the words we're using through this, because it will be seen through a different lens by many, and that's why I didn't like the. So sorry, Steve. I say it like I should have said more about it before, but the Global Trust Registry as a term has such a risk of being misunderstood. But I don't want to change it now, and I'll.
But I think your approach to leaving that as the name for the project, as opposed to the name for the product, which the project team can discuss and propose, right?
Yeah.
So I think totally love
feel
the
empowered,
idea
right?
of not changing it. I originally in 2007 created an identity trust registry for a global legal identity framework. So that was like, you know, a long time ago. And it was very much before there was even words to even talk about half of what we're talking about right now. You couldn't even, it was impossible. It took like decades to even articulate some of the things that you've amazingly covered very well in this project. So I definitely don't disagree with the approach and the meaning, and of course, the history of the terms identity and trust, you know, but it's also to understand, you know, that when you unpack these technically, it has, you know, many vectors, not just the vector for identification-based surveillance. So that's it.
And I'll get you to have the last word, Paul, in a second. There is one other thing that I'm very keen to avoid at the moment, at least, is not bringing in unnecessarily the personal identity kind of thing. At some point, it'll become very important who the officers of a company are. Who the representatives of a company are, and are they a fit, proper officer, if you like, can they represent the company in doing a transaction? But I don't want to include that yet in these conversations. I'm trying to sort of put those for later, 2.0 or something of this discussion. Paul, final words.
Yeah, hopefully not too final. I think the other thing I'm just conscious of, and I put it in the chat as well, but there's in the EU, they're talking about business identities. So that's not personal identities, but it's legal person identities. So having it effectively in Australian terms, it'd be a My ID for business as opposed to a My ID for individuals. And that's separate to the actual the registry certificate, if that makes sense. And they're also working on in the EU this registry for wallet-relying parties. So who can participate in the EU digital identity ecosystem? Well, each member state has to have a wallet-relying party registry, and there has to be a registration process with each. If you're a Switzerland company that's wanting to participate, you've got to register in Switzerland with a Switzerland wallet relying party. So I just think that we've just got to be careful. There's a lot of discussion and money and everything else going with that discussion at the moment.
Yep.
And I just think it's important I think we can look what they've done in that standard as well, because it's sort of, if you look at the global level, you've got like OpenID and folks like that working on the overall technical standard. But where this entity registration and registrar model comes in is only into the ETSI standard, not into the OpenID or ARF into the architecture. But it might be useful.
It's certainly important to understand it, Paul. And that was why last night's conversation for me was really useful. I was talking to the sort of very much engaged representatives of a German initiative, which is both German and global and EU. And yes, we've got on the call last night, we had the Netherlands representatives, so the Dutch Chamber of Commerce was being represented by one of the participants, and we also have I think the need to pull in the Swiss group. I mean, obviously, again, we don't want to get tangled, for example, with Swiss ID. You know, the conversation right now that's so hot in Switzerland, or even digital ID in the UK. That's a separate concern for what we want to do about trade. So we want to keep nice and calm. It's about business. It's about trade. At some point, yes, we'll get into the personal stuff, but not now.
It's not necessarily personal stuff, John. It's sort of saying in the wallet relying party is just another registry. Like you can have a register of organizations or a register of locations or whatever it might be, you know, or land or trademarks. It's just another registry the state's keeping. But I just think we've got to be careful we don't. I suppose I'm just aware of the amount of effort and money that the EU are putting into.
Exactly. So my strategy, if you like, is to respect that, not just respect it, but to actually take advantage in a positive sense of that, such that all the work and investment they're doing, we can faithfully echo, reflect on, or do something that, you know, at worst amplifies it rather than, you know, anything else. It doesn't conflict with it or compete with it. That's the last thing we want to be seen to be doing. So we have to sort of carefully listen and understand, and then try and make sure that what we're doing is actually sort of simpatico, is the Italian word that came into mind for some reason. Sympathetic too.
It shouldn't be incompatible with, but I think too there is a pattern in trade where you've got long trust chains, if that's the right word for it, which are not the same as the typical three-party issuer, holder, verifier present, you know, pattern. And that's why we're deliberately not talking about wallets and things like that, because a consignment of goods doesn't do verifiable presentations, right? You're actually traversing a graph of verifiable linked data as opposed to doing the identity binding through a wallet, right? And we want to leave the wallets to the wallet people, where that's not for us, right?
Yeah, I'm not confused. Just to be clear, I'm not confusing the two.
No. I hear you both. I hear you both, and you're both right. Steve, there's going to be a lovely conversation you and I can have, and hopefully with the group, around whether we can consider an enterprise wallet that behaves in a certain way to be a useful part of our story. But I'm very aware not to confuse the discussion by getting people to think about three-cornered hat sort of verifier, holder, issuer kind of thing, when in fact we have a more expansive model in mind of the linked data. So all that is what we want to explore in the Digital Identity Anchor deep dive. That will probably be in 2 weeks' time. And I guess thank you all very, very much for the participation in this meeting. I'll draw it to a close. All the minutes will be up in about an hour or so, and we'll see you on the next call, I hope.
Thanks all.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thanks, Steve, and thanks to the others. I know the others have passed away, so we'll see you soon. Cheers. Bye.